Welcome to This Week in South Carolina. I'm Gavin Jackson. With a rise in violence throughout the country, we sit down with Clemson University psychology professor Dr. Robin Kowalski to discuss her research on dealing with the aftermaths of these events. One such event was the tragedy at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. We sit down with Chris Singleton, who lost his mother, Sharonda, who was one of the 9 that was brutally murdered in that massacre. And we talked to him about how to overcome grief and find forgiveness. Chris, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely, man. Thank you for having me.
So you're currently in the middle of your Black History Month reading tour that's taking you across the country. Tell us about your message of tolerance, forgiveness, and love that you're spreading right now.
Absolutely. During Black History Month, I think it's important that everybody celebrates, and so the mission that I have of unity is pretty universal. So it's been really cool, man. Toys for Tots has partnered up with me, and we've had a great impact so far, but we're not done yet.
Mm-hmm. So we talk about this message of forgiveness and tolerance. What are you specifically saying to kids out there? What are you trying to break through and kind of get them to understand?
Yeah, I think with the younger kids, man, it's okay to say sorry. It's okay to mess up, and it's okay to ask for forgiveness or give forgiveness. And I think at a young age, sometimes we think if we do something wrong, it's the end of the world, and that shouldn't always be the case. So just teaching that as I'm on the road has been something I've tried to highlight.
And when it comes to maybe spreading that message to like adults as well, talk to us about maybe breaking through to folks and getting that message to them as well.
Yeah, that message is something that I used to have trouble sharing because I'm so young, but now I understand. It's that everybody has a story, and we don't know what their story is, so we can't judge people without knowing the full background of every individual that we come into contact with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, everyone does have a story, and sometimes we don't realize that, and we maybe pop off on people or say things we shouldn't say, and then you realize that they have some background there as well. And when we talk about backgrounds, we talk about the tragedy that happened at Mother Emanuel AME Church back in 2015, where your mother was killed. She was one of the 9 that died there that day. Tell us about your specific journey to forgiveness and how you've experienced it.
Yeah, for me personally, I know it was something out of this world that placed forgiveness on my heart, and really in our community, I feel like it was placed on us. It wasn't something that I tried to, had the 10 steps to doing it or whatever it may be. But now I've realized the power of forgiveness, and I try to make that practical for others after receiving that blessing myself.
Mm-hmm. How did you get to that point, Chris? I mean, it seems like, everyone was just so shocked by the atrocities that happened that day, and then to kind of get to this point, to be so mature and to just forgive, I think a lot of people still can't really comprehend that.
Yeah, I think it's important that we forgive, but it's impossible to forget. And for me personally, I think that I figured out what's on the other side of forgiveness, right? On the other side of forgiveness, I don't have to hate all people that don't look like me. On the other side of forgiveness, I can be a great father, great husband, and not continue to struggle with the PTSD that I had. So there's tangible things on the other side of forgiveness, and then saying, I forgive my mother's killer for doing what he did, and to my church family, saying that orally, it also makes it real for me as well. So there's different steps that I took, but knowing what's on the other side, what's the reward, was definitely the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. What's your advice to folks that are struggling with maybe doing what you've done or who are in the middle of grief right now or experiencing tragedy?
Yeah, I think we've got to have a way to honor the people that we lost. If you're grieving, whether it's a person that they lost to a certain type of cancer, maybe go run a 5K in their honor, or maybe you cook that recipe that they couldn't always get right, but you're going to get it right for them. So there's different ways that we can honor our loved ones that have been lost. But also, if you're struggling with forgiveness, you have to sit down and tell yourself, okay, if I do forgive, will it actually help me? Because in our minds, we think that we're setting somebody else free, but there's a quote that says forgiveness is setting a prisoner free, only to later realize that you yourself are the prisoner. So we have to figure out what it will set us free from, and that'll give us the motivation to even want to start that journey.
Mm-hmm. Can you apply that to other things maybe in the past too that people maybe deal with? I mean, we talk about Black History Month. We know it's a very difficult time in the history when it comes to African Americans in our country. Obviously not so easy to just writ large forgive for some of those past sins, but how do you see Black history? How do you deal with that? And maybe what's your advice to folks who are trying to understand that journey?
Yeah, I think we live in the greatest country in the world, if you ask me. But we have some rough history, and so forgiveness isn't saying that everything that happened is all peachy keen, but forgiveness is saying, hey, I want to move forward. And I look at this month as a way to celebrate all the amazing Black heroes that have come before me. I knew I wouldn't have the job, the career, the life that I have without people like Malcolm X, Dr. King, Rosa Parks, and so many others. I even think about guys like LeBron James, who's the all-time leading scorer in NBA history now. And so I think we keep setting the bar higher, and they're passing the baton for people like me, and I hopefully one day I can pass it along to my son.
And when we see tragedies in the news, I mean, I'm sure it's triggering to you and so many folks who have been affected by shootings and other horrific incidents across our country. But most recently, the killing of Tyree Nichols in Memphis, the shootings that affected the Asian community in Southern California. How do you cope with these situations? What's your advice to folks who keep seeing this over and over again and just think that they can't bear it anymore, even if they're just indirectly affected by this?
Yeah, and me personally, man, I watch every single video. I'm a person that I want to see how in the world this is happening. I want to see the details of it because I can't fathom it. It doesn't make sense to me. And so I never want to be desensitized to what crazy stuff happens in the world. And I advise people to also feel that same way, right? If wrong is wrong, let's continue to say that it's wrong, and let's not just say, another terrible thing has happened, but let's actually feel that. If we have to shed tears, let's shed tears. Let's not pretend like this is just normal, because it's not normal. When we see things like what happened with Tyree Nichols or what happened in California and what continues to happen in our world, we need to continue to convey that that's wrong.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about unity, you talk about loving your neighbor. These are just qualities that we should all embrace. Obviously, the golden rule, I think, is probably the best rule for all of us to follow, to have a happy and respectful life. But when we see such a hyper-polarized world, such a hyper-partisan world too, what keeps you going? What do you have to keep doing to break through and hopefully get your message to stick to some folks?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's key for me is that I kind of stay out of politics, because you always have to pick a side when you play politics. And so that's probably one reason why I'll never run for anything, but I don't know what God has in store for me. But that's one way that I kind of stay out of it. Most people don't always believe one side or the other, right? We're beautiful human beings that are diverse in thought, diverse in culture. And so none of us really feel all the way this way or all the way that way. But the society makes us want to choose. And so for me, I kind of break down the fact that, none of us truly think all one way or the other. And I put it into stories. I, try to talk in stories, just like the most famous man that ever walked this earth, Jesus, kind of spoke in parables. So I try to do it in a way that people can relate. And I've seen good things happen from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to ask you just how, when we talk about division, we always think about the Thanksgiving dinner table. Obviously, it's January, February right now, but what's your advice for folks who are maybe trying to break through to another side, or, you're in an argument with someone and everyone's always dug in on their own sides? Have you been able to be successful in breaking through to some folks and maybe sharing your perspective on something? And if so, how do you do that?
Absolutely. I think first we need to listen to understand. In this culture that we're in today, we listen to tell somebody where they're wrong, and we can't wait to jump down somebody's throat, right? There could be 15 or 20% truth to what somebody's saying with hard facts. And, if a little bit of it is off, or if we don't agree with a small portion of it, we're ready to jump at somebody. And so for me, I stop and I listen to somebody else's story, their perspective, because I haven't lived the life that they have. And so if that's the case, then listening to somebody else, listening before we speak is important. But also at the end of the day, unfortunately, some people have been taught wrong for decades. And so it may take a little while for you to pierce their heart and get them to love people, regardless of where they're from or what they look like.
Yeah, listening is definitely key to a lot of solving a lot of our problems out there too. And that's why we're here talking to you, Chris Singleton. Thank you so much for joining us. It's Chris Singleton. He's a former professional baseball player turned author turned motivational speaker. Thanks again.
Absolutely.
Dr. Robin Kowalski is a psychology professor at the Clemson University, and she joins us now to talk about mental health, school shootings, and her research, as well as much more. Dr. Kowalski, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I want to start off broadly and ask about mental health awareness. It's a term we keep hearing a lot about. It seems to be more prevalent in society now. It seems to be destigmatized as well when we talk about mental health treatments, which is probably a big step forward for folks in your field. Do you feel like we are seeing some changes in how people and policymakers approach mental health and treatment these days?
I think there has been increased attention to it. And I think the increased attention is helping with the destigmatization. But I think I think the destigmatization is more on the global level rather than the individual level. So, yes, I think we're making progress, but I think we have a long way to go toward improving mental health awareness.
And why do you think we're finally getting this attention? Do you think it's because of tragedies, because it's horrible shootings, and we always seem to blame mental health?
Yeah, that's a great question. I certainly think that that's contributing to it. We have so much increased media attention over the last few years, particularly with school shootings and other, like you said, national tragedies. And I think when things like that arise, the risk, of course, is that there's a habituation factor that occurs. But I think the positive upside, if you can say that there is one, is that I think it does make us more aware. I think people start, doing more research and oh, what could be causing this. So I think that has led to just the increased scrutiny into the causes of it, and therefore increased attention into what we can do about what we perceive as causes or correlates of the different tragedies.
So not so much as a scapegoat as much as maybe just more attention.
Absolutely, because with the school shootings, for example, we know that there are certain antecedent conditions that are not meant to, at least based on the research that we've done and some other people have done, and those antecedent conditions are never meant to profile. There's plenty of people who have mental health issues, obviously, who don't go on to become school shooters. We know that rejection is a key antecedent condition of people who are involved in school shootings, but there's plenty of people, for example, who are bullied who don't go on to become school shooters. But I think what we can take away from that is, if we know that these antecedent conditions exist, then we can implement programs, mental health awareness programs, anti-bullying programs, or bullying prevention programs is probably the more appropriate term, that will um, you know, decrease the likelihood that people who might have gone on to perpetrate school shootings, that we can decrease the probability that that would occur.
Dr. Kowalski, your research focuses on complaining, teasing, and bullying, like you're talking about, and also a focus on cyberbullying, as well as the concept of mattering in relation to school shootings. So we'll talk about all
Yeah.
these, but let's start with school shootings and shooters. You were just mentioning that there's not really a profile for a school shooter. It seems like it could be anyone, I guess, and that is a bit worrisome in itself too. But we haven't seen many school shootings in South Carolina. The last one I think that was really on our radar was that 2016 shooting at Townville Elementary School, which claimed the life of Jacob Hall. But there's always, a week doesn't really go by in South Carolina where a parent isn't getting a message from a son or a daughter saying we're on lockdown at school, which I can only imagine what that sends to a parent's mind at that point. So talk to us about school shooters and, typically how they get to that point where they see that as the only way out.
So, let me expand upon those sort of antecedent variables I mentioned before. So, back several years ago, we did some research looking at the shootings it was K through 12 shootings, and they had to meet certain criteria, like the shooting had to occur at school during the school day. So things that happened at football games or, other sporting events didn't meet our criteria. And there were five. Again, I'm just going to call them correlates or antecedent conditions. And one was a long-term history of rejection, like the bullying. Another one was a history of psychological problems. Another one was an acute rejection experience. Most of the K through 12 shooters are male, and most of them are white males. And we can talk about that later if you want to. There's also a fascination with death and a fascination with guns and violence. So many of these shooters are fascinated with prior shooters and prior school shootings that have taken place. So we found at that time, the study was published in 2003, so this was some time ago. We found that there were 15 shootings that met our criteria. So more recently, though, just a few years ago, we wanted to see, if those same correlates held up. And they did, and the number of shootings that met our criteria was a longer time span, of course, was much higher, was in the 50s. And again, there's been lots more school shootings that have taken place, but we had a very narrow set of criteria that have occurred since that time. But I think to your point, given that we have this relatively high prevalence of shootings that have occurred, like I mentioned, we can implement anti-bullying prevention programs. But you mentioned mattering earlier, and mattering is a fairly recent psychological phenomenon that's fascinating. And I was talking to one of my friends yesterday about the construct of mattering, and her comment was, she goes, "I just think mattering is related to everything."
Can you define it? Can you tell us what that is?
Yes, I can, and I don't disagree with her. Mattering is it's the degree to which we feel important or significant, or the degree to which we make other people feel like they're important or significant. And the converse of it is that people who feel like they don't matter, they feel like they're invisible. And so, that think about what that would feel like. That would not feel good to feel like that you were invisible to others. And, you can imagine that people who feel like they are rejected or feel like they don't belong, you know, that means that they feel like they don't matter. And we've recently done a study looking at suicide posts in one of the subreddits on Reddit, obviously, and we found that in over 70% of those posts, anti-mattering was present. Which again, that I think that speaks to the realness and the prevalence of this construct of mattering in people's day-to-day lives. And so I think what comes out of that is, to the degree that we can make people feel like they are important, that they are significant, that they belong, that they matter, I think we can help to reduce, speaking to the school shootings in particular, I think we can reduce the shootings. People who feel marginalized feel like they don't matter. And it honestly takes so little to make somebody feel like they matter. Just a kind word, or why don't you sit with us for lunch, or, it really does not take a lot of effort. And so to the degree that any of us can just reach out at whatever level, elementary school, middle school, high school, and beyond, and we believe the same thing applies. You mentioned cyberbullying. It really, my friend was right. It really does apply.
I was going to say,
everything.
it seems like it's such a root situation here when you talk about mattering and letting someone be recognized and seen. I know we're talking about mental health issues too. I'm sure that's a compounding factor, but I feel like you can just get to, just a simple step here in terms of getting people involved or pay attention to more folks, whether that's a teacher, a parent, or even a manager, a boss, or someone like that, and kind of
Absolutely
get around all these issues.
Oh, absolutely. It really knows no limits, nor does it know a specific situation. It applies across the board, across ages. It's limitless.
So that's something that we can all maybe take away and work better
Absolutely.
at. But when we talk about, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I was going to agree with you.
Yeah, simple things. But we've seen the Governor McMaster, talk about, making a big push for school resource officers. When we talk about school safety, we talk about school shootings. There's I know he still wants to put about $27 million towards that effort, but there's also a study he commissioned last year, which was to look at mental health counselors in schools too. And right now it was about one counselor for every 1,300 students in the state, which is pretty jarring. And I know there's a lot of money that's in his budget right now to be put towards addressing that matter, whether it's recruiting and retaining professionals at the Department of Mental Health, and also dealing with a lot of services that have been underfunded. So would you, do you feel like that will fix the problem? I know we just talked about mattering. It seems like that's a pretty big root cause for things, but are SROs or counselors, are they just, I guess, complements to this overall problem?
I think that's an excellent way of putting it. I think they're complements to it. I think the statistics are pretty staggering in terms of, so few counselors for so many young people. And so I think that, certainly I think we need more counselors. I do think we need more counselors. Let me address the SRO issue. I think we can certainly benefit from having more SROs, but there's research to suggest, and I want to be careful how I say this. I think that lockdown drills are important. I think that having school security measures are important, but I also think that we need to really investigate. Most of your school shooters come from within the schools, so not all of them, but most of them. So I think to the degree that we have active shooter drills, for example, and again, I don't want to say those aren't important. They are, but they can also instill fear and anxiety in the students. And you're also teaching the potential shooter exactly what to or not to do within the shooting thing. So I definitely think schools need SROs. How many? I think that's something that we need to evaluate, and how much money needs to be devoted to that. But I definitely think that I loved your word about complementing. I definitely think school counselors in particular, our mental health counselors are a nice complement to all the other things like the bullying prevention programs and the mental health awareness that needs to be done.
A complement to solving the problem there.
Absolutely.
But really quickly, before we move on, Dr. Kowalski, I want to ask you, what should parents, what should teachers, maybe even friends in these schools be looking out for? You're talking about folks who have been, rejection. There's acute rejection. There's people not feeling like they matter. What can people look for? What can they do?
That's a great question also. So I think one thing that they can look for is leakage. They call it leakage. It's really disclosure. The vast majority of your school shooters or potential school shooters talk about it. They may create a video, or they may say to their friend, "Don't come to school tomorrow." Okay, well, those are warning signs, and I think we need to pay attention to those warning signs. And sometimes if a friend comes up to you and says, "Hey, don't come to school tomorrow," I'm planning to do X, Y, and Z. You There's a sort of a lack of credibility there. Like, no, not really gonna do anything because this is your friend, or this is, one of your classmates. But I think we need to encourage young people to pay attention. Even if it is sort of an idle threat, that person is crying out for help. So you were talking about mental health awareness. We need to pay attention to that.
And when we talk about, your students, you teach these new generations of psychologists to go into the field. Are more and more of them interested in going to some of these schools, going to some of these districts that are in need? I mean, obviously the pay is what it is. It's got to be a difficult uphill battle to go into this field. What's it like right now on the ground when it comes to the students that you teach?
Yeah, so I honestly I have a lot that are very interested in going into the field. The problem that I see is more the requirements to get into the programs, to train them. It's becoming increasingly difficult. A lot of the programs are wanting, go and get a couple years experience, and then we'll let you apply to our doctoral programs or our master's programs. Well, how are they going to get the experience, without having the advanced degrees and things like that? So that's where I see, from my end, where I see the problem. And that has become increasingly difficult in the last 5 to 10 years. I think we need to do something about that. You've got people who are willing to go into to do the work. Let's give them the opportunity to do so.
Gotcha. And I know you're not complaining there, but it sounds like a complaint. Let's talk about let's talk about complaining for a minute, because I think we all like to do that. I know I do, but I like to be constructive with it, because there's no real point if you're not. But tell us about your research and complaining. What are there benefits? Are there different types of complaining? Tell us a little bit about this. We have a couple minutes left.
Yeah, so it's such a fun area to do research in. So because if you think about it, complaining is a behavior that we all engage in, albeit to different degrees. And I love to dabble in research in areas that very few people have dabbled in, but yet it's a behavior that, again, like I said, that everybody engages in. So what we believe is that if done in moderation and if done strategically, in other words, you're not going to go and just complain all the time, because then you're going to destroy relationships. And if you do it, you pick your audience carefully. You don't use up the same person over and over again. That complaining can be very effective. There's plenty of I think each person, again, who uses it in moderation and who does it strategically can find supporting evidence for that.
You say if you do it strategically, but then you also mentioned destroying relationships. So you're saying if I complain all the time, that's going to really just grate on people? It's going to grate on my approach towards people? How does that work?
It will, yeah. It uses people up. It wears on people. If you continue to just complain over and over and over again without being willing to do anything about it, there's different types of complaining. There's instrumental complaining. There's expressive complaining. Instrumental complaining is complaining that's designed to accomplish a very specific outcome. But, if I go to my next door neighbor and complain about, the cable company or something like that, and I do it incessantly, well, she's going to tire of that. I don't know that she would completely ditch me as a friend, but she's eventually going to say, enough. If you are really that dissatisfied with it, go and complain to the company itself. But if it's expressive complaining, even still, if I'm just chronically morose and complaining about this and that also wears on people, because it's like, just, move on, find a way. I teach my students about ways to change their attributional style, because it comes across as this chronic pessimism. And there are ways to deal with it. You can check yourself. You can journal about it. There are ways to deal with your complaining that can be more effective than just continuing to, express it incessantly to other people.
I was going to say, when it comes to addressing it, does confrontation work? Because when I hear someone complain over and over again, it's like, okay, enough. Like, does that work? Does that give that person at least something on their radar to recognize?
Yeah, I think if you want to use confrontation now, I think you want to do it constructively. Like, you want to say, have you suggested, or have you tried, journaling? Have you tried doing something else? Have you tried talking to the company directly? I think you want to give them, because a lot of those people are, number one, unaware that they're doing it. There's he's a former pastor, actually. He has a program through the Complaint Free World, and he has people wear these, kind of like the Live Strong bracelets, they're purple bracelets. And I think the reason the program works is because it makes you aware. When I started doing research on complaining, it was like it was coming out of the woodwork. I mean, it was like all of a sudden everybody was
Yeah.
complaining. And so I think when we become aware of it, and those bracelets have been used in marriage counseling, where as soon as you start complaining about your spouse, you have to move it to the other arm.
Hmm.
So I think a lot of it is just increasing our awareness of it. And once you become aware of anything, it's like, whoa, I can check the behavior better if I realize that I'm actually engaging in the behavior. So I think by confronting people about it, particularly constructively, you may be making them aware of something that they didn't even realize that they were doing to begin with.
Gotcha. Well, that's some good advice from a lot of research that we've been talking about with Dr. Robin Kowalski. She's a Clemson University psychology professor. Thanks so much for joining us. A lot to think about there.
Thanks so much for having me. So much fun.
Great. To stay up to date with the latest news throughout the week, check out the South Carolina Lead. It's a podcast that I host on Tuesdays and Saturdays that you can find on southcarolinapublicradio.org or wherever you find podcasts. For South Carolina ETV, I'm Gavin Jackson. Be well, South Carolina.